Top Gun. What's that process like getting selected? And then talk to me about Top Gun itself. Everyone's seen the movie, I assume. So
If you've seen the movie, I mean, that's pretty much it, right? You don't need to know anything else.
Go out there, overstress every single airframe.
Exactly. Yeah. And then just, drink a lot and play volleyball. In reality, there's basically a couple ways that you go to Top Gun. Usually it happens right after your first sea tour. So you have a 3-year sea tour. And if you get selected to be an instructor at one of the weapons schools, either on the East Coast or West Coast, an instructor on the staff at Top Gun, and there's a couple other billets. I think for the training squadrons for the F-18s, they have a billet. Some of the test squadrons have one as well. Then you would go through the class, and then it's changed now how long the class is, but it's about 8 weeks long. You go through the class, and then you go to wherever your assignment was. For me, I went through as an adversary. So, when you go through the class, you either go through as a fighter, an adversary, or a controller. They have controllers. We have Marine controllers, intercept controllers, E2 controllers, shipboard controllers. They go through the class as well. So as an adversary, it was kind of nice because I had already done my sea tour, done my shore tour, and then had checked in to the adversary squadron, and they said, okay, we're sending you to Top Gun. And so when you finish up as an adversary, because what you do is, as you're going through the course, you as adversary are in charge of all the red air. So when I went through, the admiral who was in charge of NSOC, now it's called NOTIC, but at the time, the Navy Strike and Air Warfare Center in Fallon, the admiral was one of the guys that was involved in the only Hornet shoot down in Desert Storm, Admiral Fox, and he was one of the wingmen on one of my sorties. So Admiral came in, I gave him the presentation. Admiral, this is your job. He's like, Roger that. And go out. So it was a pretty cool experience. The flying, I think, was top notch. I mean, long days. You'd wake up early. You'd brief your sortie. You go fly. You come back. Long in depth debriefs, and then you go to the O Club, and because there's really nothing else to do in Fallon. But it was just over and over. But it was fantastic flying. And then after graduating, go back to the squadron, and now you're an adversary and instructor. So you're training the other guys in your squadron on the latest and greatest tactics. And then, you go to Key West and you do a 1v1 with a nugget that's getting ready for workups, and you BFM them, and you're basically just training them in air-to-air combat.
That's funny. Yeah. I've had Admiral Fox on the podcast twice. It's been great to talk to him and hear his story.
Yeah,
for sure. So, for the Air Force, we have our aggressor squadrons. We have weapons school. Weapons school and Top Gun are often compared. I would like to talk about the integration piece, but it's probably more appropriate to talk about the integration piece with our adversary squadron. So we send guys to go be adversary air, but they become SMEs, subject matter experts. Maybe they're in Russian missiles or Chinese missiles or radar systems, etc. And there's going to be one guy that's in charge of knowing about Russian radars.
Right.
To then teach the others. I assume the Navy probably does something comparable to that.
Yeah, we do. Every year, it's usually around tailhook. They have what's called a re-red or a re-blue, where patch wearers go back to Fallon, and they give them an update on what the latest and greatest are on the tactics, both on the red side and on the blue side. And they've tried this before, where within TSW, each squadron has a specialty for kind of really what they're, whether they're going to be Russian or Chinese or whatever. I don't think that's ever really stuck. So usually what happens is within the squadron, you have a person that's going to be a SME on a certain area. But all our events change. The threat changes for every single event, and we have to be able to replicate that threat regardless. So what ends up happening is usually most guys are pretty proficient in all of them. And you go, if you have a question, you go to the guy that just went through the class most recently, and you ask him, hey, what's the latest on this? What do I need to do? how do I replicate this threat radar or this this aircraft, and they give you the latest. But it's not quite the same as the Air Force. I know when I went through the class, I kind of equated, my experience at Top Gun being kind of master's level, and I think the Air Force weapons school, I would equate that to being more of a, doctorate level.
Yeah, obviously, I never went to weapons school. The traditional flow for like a weapons officer, at least in the fighter community, is usually like 2 operational assignments on average. And that's probably a fair thing to say. And then each base is probably going to pony up maybe 1 person every 6 months, maybe 2. Again, it just depends on how many squadrons are there. And then they're going to go spend 6 months just getting drugged through the mud. Doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun.
Yeah.
What's about the average? I mean, that squadrons in the Navy are sending guys and gals to Top Gun.
Well, it's not, like I said, because in order to go to Top Gun, you have to have one of those billets. It used to be Top Gun was when they called it power projection. I think squadron would send somebody. So like in the original movie, the squadron would send somebody, and then they would come back to the squadron then and sort of teach what they learned. Now when you go through Top Gun, now you go then to a weapons school staff or to the Top Gun staff or to the Nautic staff, and so you're kind of spreading out. Now, when you finish those weapons school tours, then you do what's called a training officer tour. So then you go to a squadron, and now you are the SME for tactics for that squadron.
Okay.
And so it's a little bit different. So every squadron has one training officer, but some squadrons have more than one, Top Gun graduate, just based on where they are in their career. Because then you go from being a training officer to being a department head, which is a O4 job. And then sometimes you have your XO and CO are also Top Gun graduates.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Because I'm thinking of like the first Top Gun movie, which is comparable to like a weapons school class where you're sent every, base is ponying up a couple people, and then they go to Las Vegas and they're a class of 8 people or 9 people.
Mm-hmm.
But then they have to go back to the operational squadron to be the tactician, to be the instructor that teaches the instructors. They have to do their time, as they say, for a year or 2, the patch payback. And then as they progress in their career, they're getting kicked off the staff, coming back as commanders and DOs. So,
right.
I mean, probably similarly, like any squadron has a few patches, but there's only one squadron weapons officer at the time. And
right.
he or she is the person that is driving all the tactics in the squadron. The commander and the DO at one point might have been the squadron patch.
Yep.
But now they're doing commander and DO things.
Yeah, that's pretty similar. Once you get to your training officer tour, then sounds it's the same.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, interesting. The adversary piece is something that obviously some people find a knack for. In the operational squadron, you're often having to fly adversary air, and you're supposed to go look at the adversary books and
right.
Yeah, do a threat replication that is realistic, not just go, hey, we're gonna go completely hose my buddy who's on his whatever upgrade ride.
Yeah, right.
Which is usually what ends up happening. But did you enjoy kind of learning about other nations and the tactics they use and trying to figure out the best way to replicate those?
I really did. I thought it was really fascinating, and it when I was a Nugget, right, going through SFARP, and you said, hey, your threat at the time, the big, the base one that we trained to was the MiG-29, and then the Su-27 ended up coming along later, and that was the big bad scary one. But you really had no idea what else was going on in the world. But as an adversary, you kind of get an idea of what each threat nation is doing and where they're going with their tactics and how they're training their pilots. And I thought it was a really cool experience to kind of get to see that and then go out and fly it and pretend to be one of those guys, and try to give the guys who are getting ready to go on deployment an authentic experience that they can use and apply in real world situations.
What was some of the challenges of being an aggressor?
I'd say the biggest challenge is ego, right? I mean, if I go out and I lose a fight, I should consider that a win, right? Because that means the fighters are ready to go defend
right.
the homeland, defend their carrier, right? So that the challenge was was kind of leaving my ego at the door, understanding that there are training objectives, and when they've met the training objectives, that's a good thing. So that was probably the biggest challenge.